Welcome to this explainer on Rudyard Kipling's 1888 classic short story, The Story of Muhammad Din. We're jumping right into it today, unpacking the incredible emotional and psychological depths hidden inside what, at first glance, just looks like a simple tale about a British civil servant and a young Indian boy. We're going to see exactly how Kipling masterfully weaves together the innocence of childhood, the sheer unpredictability of life, and the incredibly rigid social divisions of colonial India.
Who is the happy man? He that sees in his own house at home little children crowned with dust, leaping and falling and crying. Now this haunting epigraph opens the story, and it instantly sets the emotional baseline for everything that follows. It hooks us right away into this universal atmosphere of fatherhood and the messy, joyful reality of childhood. But as you'll see, for our narrator, this quote hangs over the entire story like a dark shadow. It frames the absolute tragedy of a child who is, quite literally, crowned with dust, leaping, falling, and eventually crying. Which brings us to Section 1, the chubby little eccentricity. So to really understand why that opening quote hits so hard, we first need to meet our central figure. Muhammad Din's brief narrative arc is, well, it's just heartbreaking. It starts off so simply. His father, Imam Din, politely asks the narrator for an old chipped polo ball for his son to play with. From there, we see the boy curiously wandering into the narrator's dining room, and then he starts building these amazingly elaborate architectural palaces out of dust and debris out in the garden. But this incredibly warm narrative takes a rapid downturn. It takes us so quickly from playful curiosity to a sudden fever, and ultimately to the burying ground. If you want to perfectly visualize the boy's joyful eccentricity, just think of 4 simple traits: innocent, cheerful, playful, and lovable. Honestly, he's just a typical toddler, completely oblivious to the complicated, heavy concerns of adult colonial life. He wanders around wearing this ridiculously inadequate little shirt, his thumb in his mouth, just crooning to himself. And it's exactly this unblemished innocence, this lovable simplicity, that makes his impending fate so emotionally devastating for us as readers, and of course, for the narrator.
Section 2. Innocence, Affection, and Death.
Okay, so picture this. The little boy is caught trespassing in the narrator's dining room, and he's startled almost into a fit when the sahib suddenly appears. His father, Imam Din, comes rushing in to save the day. He playfully but judicially scolds the boy, calling him a big badmash, basically a rascal, who is absolutely destined for the jail-khana because of his behavior. It's such a great moment because it brings Kipling's 19th century voice vividly to life, highlighting a universally relatable parent-child bond. The baby even protests through his tears, declaring he's not a badmash, he's a man. It's just a deeply human, warmly humorous moment.
But then, the pacing shifts abruptly. We go through this incredibly harsh progression. We start with Muhammad Din, the completely innocent child. Naturally, a genuine affection develops between him and the narrator. They even establish this little routine, greeting each other every single day on the neutral ground of the garden. But then, out of nowhere, we hit illness. And shortly after that, death. The sheer contrast between the warmth of his childhood play and this sudden, devastating illness is incredibly jarring. It's a stark reminder of just how fragile and unpredictable life truly is.
Section 3. Crossing Colonial Boundaries.
Peeling back the layers of this story, we find a massive social and racial divide between our 2 main characters. Think about it. On one side, you have the narrator's world. He's part of the ruling British colonial community, inherently powerful, authoritative. On the completely opposite side is Muhammad Din's world, a young Indian boy, the son of a butler, belonging to the local, poor, and politically powerless population. That massive gap is exactly what makes the bridge of their brief emotional connection so incredibly significant.
Because despite that vast social distance we just talked about, the narrator develops a very real, genuine affection for his servant son. I mean, he literally checks his horse daily just to make sure their greetings aren't rushed or slurred over. He gets genuinely troubled when the boy isn't there to welcome him. This proves a huge central theme in Kipling's work, that ordinary human emotions and true empathy absolutely can, and do, exist completely outside of rigid colonial hierarchies and cultural boundaries.
Now, hold on a second. Do you remember this scene where the boy builds that wondrous little palace in the garden out of polo balls, dust, and marigolds? The narrator tells us that he stumbled upon it and, unawares, trampled it into confusion past all hope of mending. But scholars ask us to look a little bit closer here. Was this really just a clumsy accident?
Let's explore that in Section 4, Psychology of the Colonizer.
To answer that question about the trampled garden, we can actually turn to some fascinating academic research from Quest journals, written by Abhijit Mehdi. This research adds a whole new layer to the Anglo-Indian experience. Maddie argues that the colonizer's psyche was often dominated by a really complex mixture of deep guilt and a subconscious fear of the colonized other. Basically, the colonizing self was constantly anxious about whether the empire was permanent and felt threatened by the mysteries of the very land they were occupying.
So when the narrator casually destroys the boy's intricate garden palace, scholars argue this can be read entirely metaphorically. It represents the colonizer's unconscious drive to disrupt and dominate any space claimed by a colonized subject. Even though the narrator insists, "Heaven knows I had no intention of touching the child's work," his physical act of walking over a non-normative space, a child's terrain, and breaking it apart, that directly mirrors the larger aggressive political act of colonization.
And this builds perfectly on the colonial construct of the empire, acting as a family, where the native population is viewed merely as an untrained child. If you look at it through this psychoanalytic lens, a child building a tiny rightful palace in the dust unconsciously triggers the narrator's ingrained political duty to assert power. Subconsciously, he feels he must break apart the native safe house to prevent any anti-imperial activity, no matter how small or how innocent it is. And it's this exact dynamic that ultimately leads to a profound sense of remorse in the narrator.
Section 5. The universality of grief. Moving beyond the psychological critique, the story arrives at the Musselman burying ground, and it just strips away all of those complex imperial politics. Kipling's ultimate realization is laid completely bare here. There is no dramatic heroic event at the end. It's just the quiet carrying of a small body wrapped in white cloth. It shows us, with heartbreaking clarity, that human fragility and grief are universal experiences. They humble all earthly authority. Death, as it turns out, doesn't care if you're British or Indian, ruling class or a servant.
Which brings us right back to our opening quote about the happy man who sees children playing in his own house at home. Now, there's this brilliant analysis by Inger K. Brogger, presented at the Kent Conference, that spotlights the narrator's profound unease. Think about his position. He is an Anglo-Indian. He's literally an invader in a foreign land. He is mourning a child that is not his own in a country where he does not organically belong.
And really, that is the devastating core of the entire story. The tragedy forces the British narrator to confront a simple, harsh truth. Because of the colonial structures he upholds and the profound displacement he experiences, he is never truly in his own house at home. The very real affection he felt for little Muhammad Din forces him face to face with his own isolation and the deep emotional entanglement of his colonial existence.
So, we want to leave you with this final thought to carry with you today. How does the absolute universality of death challenge the rigid boundaries we build in life? Does the shared experience of grief actually have the power to bridge our deepest societal divides? Or does an innocent child's death merely highlight the tragic absurdity of those colonial boundaries to begin with? Thank you so much for exploring this masterpiece with us.